thank you folks for attending this session here on the Science on Schema.org cluster. This is intended to be just a very informal kind of business meeting to talk about the cluster and how we want to govern it. And then there's a bunch of issues in the GitHub for this cluster that we can review too. And then really leave it open to kind of whatever you want to talk about here. So I've got the agenda as a Google Doc. I think Kai has written it as a bit.ly link here on these whiteboards here. So feel free to jump in there and take notes and add your name to the participants list. Right, okay, so there's been a proposal in the GitHub issue queue at this first link, issue 30. So I'm gonna hop off to that. And I'll give you a second to kind of review it. We can talk about it. I can minimize this, right? Okay. Okay, so just like a really quick primer on the group and what we're doing. So this is the Schema.org cluster at ESIP, and what the cluster was designed to do is to really talk about two things. One, the governance of some guidance documentation that was put together out of this NSF EarthCube initiative that really helped folks understand the Schema.org documentation to describe repositories and the services that they offer, but also data sets. And that was done just through some conceptual drawings of what those Schema.org documentation for the vocabulary were thought about how to use, but also some JSON LD snippets of what implementing those guidance would look like. And so the cluster was sort of set up as a way to keep those documents living and moving forward as Schema.org continues to grow over time. And then there was some discussion about the geosciences and sciences in general, just sort of needing terms and concepts outside the scope of what you can find at Schema.org. And so the cluster also provided an opportunity to elevate those issues to the group and then work on implementing some type of extension outside of Schema.org to use those in your JSON LD or Schema.org flavors on your website pages. So if this is something that you completely didn't expect, please feel free to walk and go to a different session. I want to give folks that opportunity, but we hope that you stay and join and participate in this effort. And so today what we wanted to focus on is that over the past couple months at the telecons, we've been discussing, well, how do we operate? How do we respond to the monthly releases that happen at Schema.org, and how do we respond to guidance documents and changing them? And so this first issue is sort of outlining what we were hoping to do. And so obviously we decided on that these guidance documents would live in GitHub and that we would use the issue queue as sort of like a way to inform the agenda for the telecons that happen twice a month, the first Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern time in the US here, and the fourth Tuesday at 2:30 Eastern time. And so we can get you jacked in there at a certain time later. But we're gonna use the issue queue. And so the first thing was like, okay, how do we help folks create a really good issue, and so that we don't have ambiguity and you know, have someone just submit something and have the thought get lost. And so we really need someone to step up and help us create some templates for issues. And we thought there'd be a template for guidance documents and also places where you could propose an extension to schema.org. So that was the first idea in this governance, is just having a template for GitHub issues. The second was trying to talk through a governance workflow across those issues. And so, okay, how do we use Git to fork and to accept new proposals? And so we're just having a conversation with Matt Jones about that. And so we want to dig into that and get your thoughts there. One interesting idea that's been floating around is this idea of an architectural decision record. Raise your hand if you've heard of an architectural decision record. 1, 2, okay, so a couple of you. Okay, so what an architectural decision record does is it takes a really long conversation on a GitHub issue and really condenses it down into 4 things. One is just sort of like what the issue was, the consequences of a decision being made, the status of that decision, and the outcome. So it's really just sort of like condensing this sort of long string of text and someone trying to decipher like who are the authoritative voices in this issue, and boils that down. That's one idea for GitHub workflow governance. And this is just continuing on that. I just want to highlight this whole issue, and then we can open the floor up to discuss it. So the second is like, okay, how do we do branches and releases?
This conference will now be recorded.
Thanks, Kai. And the last one is components of a good branch and fork. So I guess that's what expectations there are on files here. So that's the basis of this first issue, and feel free to grab a mic, or I can pass this one around, and I'll stay up here just to, yeah. So go ahead, Kai.
Okay, starting with Ruth.
I guess I've brought this up before, and that is that there's actually a community other than developers and software types, etc., that need to be intimately involved in this. And none of them really like GitHub. And it was a little bit of pulling teeth at that meeting, and actually that's why a lot of the issues were written by, people sitting in this room who are technical. But we need a mechanism to include these communities in a way that is acceptable to those communities. For example, I know that Kirsten is very interested in making sure that samples and sample issues are risen, and they're never going to write a JSON anything, but they want, they put issues in, and somehow they need to be translated into text that is acceptable to them about what is happening, and to the technical bits that, your JSON LD snippets, for example. And that's where I think the crux of the issue really is.
So Ruth, are you saying that there's folks that want to participate but feel like they can't? And
Sorry. Sorry. Yeah, they can't really participate because they may not want to use GitHub at all. I mean, they've talked about how what they really need are best practices written in like English for data managers. And what they want is to make sure that, this problem is solved in a way that they can understand without them having to learn JSON LD.
Off to Chuck.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we probably need both, though. So part of the goal of this community was that, we can go off and develop some really nice vocabularies and ontologies, but if the web developers, mainly the web developers, and I'm talking from the CI/COE hat, the large facilities, right? Most of these guys are basically trained as web developers, right? They understand JSON. They can sort of make the extension the JSON LD. If I say something about ontology and linked data, then there's this whole, well, that's really complicated. I don't understand that, right? So part of it was trying to create some convergence between these two communities. And one way that we can do that is, through as a first pass, just like we're doing with the harmonization sort of, is that we can go through, do a first pass, create some resources that these programmers can go to when somebody like, you or I go to them and say, I want you to do this, right? And they throw up their hands and say, well, what do I do? How do I do this? How do I do it right? And Google has a lot of guidance for their, sort of markup and SEO, which is, a big deal, because you want your product catalog, your widget to be discovered over company B's widget, right? The more expressive you are about what the thing is, the higher, you know, potentially your rankings, right? And so the idea is how can we extend that sort of to the science? I think that there's a second sort of, yeah, I think Mark's point is also correct that you don't need necessarily to write JSON LDS to use GitHub there. But I think we need nicer interfaces that connect to GitHub. And so there's this, I've mentioned this before, and it was just released before Christmas, that Zuko has released something that's close to YAMS in terms of providing a user interface, being able to put new terminology in, to be able to track that, to do voting as to whether or not the proposal is a good proposal. I've been playing with it a little bit over Christmas time. It stores its information in GitHub. So it uses GitHub IDs for authentication, and it also then stores the graph representation of whatever is going on in GitHub that then can sort of complete this loop. And so I think that there's different tools based off of this sort of community that you're coming from that can be sort of integrated in a sensible way.
So I'd like to reiterate what I think you said in the beginning, which I think we need both. So we need a way to stay organized so that we have an agreement process when proposals are made about how we're going to change the guidelines or how, say, a new term is going to be developed, that it's very explicit as a community what's being proposed and people will know what the implications of that are, and that there's a release process to manage that. So I think that needs to be done in Git. But there should also be a really easy way for people to contribute new ideas or to request clarifications or changes. And I don't know what that mechanism is. I noticed that some issues have come in that are very open-ended. Somebody will write an issue that says something like, I think we should, I commented on one this morning, we should have a new section of the guidance document about metadata accuracy. And that's all the issue says. It's not a proposal for what to do. It's really an opening for a discussion that would eventually lead to a proposal. But that discussion needs to happen before you could get there. And I don't know what that tool is that lets that happen, but I agree that we need it. But I don't think it's a replacement for the kind of software management infrastructure that gets us releases that everybody can say, this is the current guidance document that everybody's using.
Yeah, there were just a couple questions that were put up there. So we've got from Mark asking about YAMS. And prior to that, we had people saying I'm non-techie, but I agree. Or is there an alternative to GitHub? I think you guys kind of, yeah. Yeah, so here, back to YAMS, and then we'll go to Stefan.
So briefly, YAMS was an experiment. I think it was presented at ESIP, 3 years ago, the winter meeting, as a tool for capturing terminology. And being able to sort of vote on that and provide an interface for end users and domain experts that they could relate to. The issue is that it was sort of abandoned. I know Lewis has created some GitHub pull requests which have been ignored, and it wasn't very semantic in its undertone. I mean, it was just a Flask app with a Postgres database. So I think that there's probably now other communities have developed some other alternatives that are probably worth exploring that take a slightly more semantic, approach to it, but also give a nice user interface where people can vote and can do these things. So hopefully that clarifies.
Hi, this is Mark. Can you all hear me?
Templates to submit and get. Would that give folks a form? It doesn't. What's the issue with the good templates? Or sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Well, I was just, in terms of, from watching the W3C DCAT revision process, right? They basically have the GitHub repo, but then they have an email list in parallel with that. And it does, it's got the potential to create some confusion, which it did when the discussions start up on the list and don't get transferred. But it does give people who are used to doing email a way to submit things and comment and see what's going on a little bit. So that might be an option.
Hello, this is Mark. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Speak loudly.
Yeah.
Okay. Just to be clear, I was not advocating an alternative to GitHub. I was telling that the non-techies need to get over it.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I could see something like a GitHub and email, but I think it would be better, maybe, have two issues in GitHub. One where you get into the techie details, one where you have the more general things, because I like having it in one environment. And Yeah, I think get over it. And I'm saying that as a non-techie. So I think we can make GitHub workable for non-techies, and it's really useful to have everything in one place. But just recognizing that we have these different audiences, and then I just wanted to throw one other audience into the mix, that we're working increasingly with an international community through RDA, and then we had a really good meeting with the polar community, international polar community, a couple months ago. So we need to be sensitive to that as well.
So I wasn't actually advocating for getting rid of Git, but I do think that 2 streams is what is really needed. Now Git has the tagging potential, and I would presume that perhaps that's multiple different kinds of templates, because I mean, a lot of what the data management community was asking for were these open-ended things. They don't really care about what the solution was in terms of JSON LD. They just wanted to make sure that people understood that this is the real issue for that community, and that community's needs need to be accommodated. And so I mean, I don't really care if it's GitHub versus email, but whatever process is used needs to include the community who's going to implement this stuff in vetting the solutions and telling you what the problems are from a not technical standpoint, but more of a data management standpoint.
Okay, great. So we feel like we can move on that issue and maybe through the templates, at least attempt to address that issue. Any other dissenting voices or other opinions there?
Mark is now in agreement with Ruth, as always.
Amen, Ruth. Right. Okay, great. Okay, I think we can move on. Or Matt, you have
Well, I just wanted to get, can we, like, by show of hands or something, get a sense of whether people think we should have a mailing list or a discussion forum in addition to the GitHub issues? Because although we got 3 voices there or something, we didn't really get everybody in the room. So I'd love to just go to get a better sense of how many people would rather see.
Yeah, well, we do have the cluster meetings, the telecon, the mailing list. So I feel like those mechanisms are in place.
There is so just to clarify, there's a lot of clutter in the room. There's a Slack channel and there is also an email list.
Oh, I was just raising my hand about it.
I mean, at some point, it's kind of like they can't hate everything, right? I mean, it's kind of, they don't like Slack, they don't like email. I don't want an email in my email inbox. I ignore enough email already. I mean, there's Gitter, if you want to do Gitter, but it's not much different than Slack. See, so you do this, and it's like, then I mean, oh yeah, you got it.
Yeah, I guess. Stand next to everybody in the room. I don't actually care what solution is picked, whether it's an email list or Slack. The real key is that community building process that one educates everybody on, whatever is used, and the ability to say, you know, if something's been hanging around Slack for 6 months and nothing happened to it, that something needs to happen to it, and that there's some mechanism to make that at least known. And the process needs to end up back there on, hi, here's what we're proposing to do about it from a technical standpoint. This is what it would mean from a data management standpoint.
Right. That's probably a good segue. So we've created a lot of issues in that scienceonschema.org repository, and there's been some talk about how we age issues out. On the telecon, we talked about having issues last a month until they get closed if there's no discussion or movement on them. Any thoughts about that? Is that too short? Is that Ruth, you should just come up here and run this whole thing.
I'm just sorry, guys. Just as I work with these communities, right? So how often does the polar data group get together? Once every 2 years. Okay. We can try and do something more frequent than that, but nobody's funding that. So I managed to get one person to show up to the schema.org telecons from that group. And that might be okay, but whether that person from Canada can speak for the entire world, highly debatable. So closing an issue, no. If it hasn't been responded to, you can't close it. I'm sorry, never. Now you can, have conversations about, well, what do we do next on this? But you can't close it, because if somebody spent the energy to even write an icky, issue, that means it's a real issue. And real issues, you can't just ignore them. I mean, we're ignoring the real issue of climate change right now. Might actually destroy civilization doing that. Do you want to be the equivalent of that?
Ouch.
On a lighter on a lighter note. On a lighter note, perhaps.
I'm just the messenger.
On a lighter note, perhaps one solution for these kinds of things is to use the system which is built into GitHub. So you say @Adam. Like, I noticed that this issue hasn't been picked up in the last 6 months. Like, was anyone working on this? Or @Ruth, like, you originally put this issue. Did you have anything more, like, working, and maybe like some sort of mechanism for that after like 6 months or something, perhaps.
Right.
Just a separate idea.
Can I chime in again?
Sure, yeah.
Sorry, I wasn't able to attend in person. The snow scared me. I think we're conflating two issues. We started with, is Git the best platform for this sort of thing? My opinion is yes, it is. Not perfect, but it's workable. The second issue is really a community engagement issue, which is a human issue, and it's going to require all sorts of different approaches. And while I hear what Ruth is saying, that we can't just rush decisions, we also can't wait for the whole world to buy in. So we do need to have some sort of mechanism for what's sometimes called lazy consensus. No objection is acceptance. But to me, it's maybe sort of defining roles within the cluster, so that Git is our platform, but we probably need to have other outreach mechanisms to keep people informed of sort of major milestones. And then we also have to have, I don't know, liaisons, champions, or something that really connect to these other communities that are really, really genuinely very interested in this, but don't have the same capacity, the same bandwidth, the same time zones as the real active people in the ESIP cluster. So trying to be as inclusive as we can be while still making reasonable progress. So I think we just separate those two issues. The technology that I propose, just go with Git and try and make it usable to non-techies and techies. And then at the same time, have that other issue of how do we make sure that we have ongoing active engagement with more peripheral, if you will, the bad word, communities.
So I agree with what you said, Mark, about the, basically there needs to be a group of people that are maintaining the space and trying to welcome people into it so that they can ask questions and follow through. The problem is that in any volunteer space like this, like maintaining standards and other things, is that the people who step up to maintain are oftentimes doing it on the side, and it becomes a huge burden for them. And so you got to be careful to not overly tax the 3 people, or we don't want Adam staying up in the middle of the night on Saturdays in order to process everything, because there's this expectation that he must write on every issue, right?
So yeah, no, I totally agree, Matt. And I think what we're talking about is making
64 there, Adam, because I want to show an example of like the type of thing that can come in. And I was just looking through the issues this morning at the earlier session, and I commented on it. And I guess I questioned, like, this issue came in as something that should be addressed. It was not clear enough for me to even understand what was being asked. And so I asked a clarifying question. If nobody ever replies to this, what do we do with it? Like, is there a period of time when we can close this because nobody understands what it's asking? Or like, whose responsibility is it to come through and actually follow through in this beyond this level? I personally think, given the volunteer nature of what this is, some of these are going to have to fall through the cracks unless somebody steps up and clarifies what it is that's being asked here. But I mean, maybe
No,
there's
I totally agree with you, Matt. That's kind of what I was trying to say. And so maybe you used the word maintenance. The maintainers group has been, info maintainers group, a different community, has really been trying to recognize that there's these different roles that help keep people engaged, and that different people have interests in doing those roles. So maybe just sort of specifying some of those roles and also specifying some of those rules. You know, if someone puts in a vague comment and they don't respond, yeah, kill it. And if somebody proposes something and there's no objection after 6 weeks or 2 months or whatever it is, then it goes forward. But then maybe there's somebody like me who's actively working to make sure that the polar community is involved. There's somebody that's actively working to make sure that we have the ongoing connection with RDA, which is a nice international connection. Things like that. Because no, we can't just burden it all onto one person, but just making sure that we're making a conscious effort to try and engage, but not, you know, not let it grind us to a halt. You know, so have some clear rules that you know, maybe a month is too short. I don't think it is necessarily, if there's an active effort to make sure that the non-techie international community has a chance to weigh in. And if somebody just puts in a, you know, vague thing and they don't follow up, we ignore it. So it's a balancing act.
Nice. Just want to highlight that Micah commented here that there's a GitHub bot that can help you mark issues as stale. I think that's an interesting idea to sort of at least tag the issues that have gone by the wayside without having to close them. Maybe Ruth.
I just wanted to say that we keep saying Git, people keep saying Git, and we're talking about GitHub, which is very different. Git is ugly and nobody should look at it unless they're a developer and they really want to. So let's, GitHub has some really nice stuff and is very friendly, at least somewhat. Anyway, I wanted to mention CF for NetCDF has just moved to GitHub for everything, all communication. I'm not sure, you know, and it is going well. It is going surprisingly well. People who are not developers, there was a lot of griping when it first came up. It's going perfectly fine. So the GitHub interface is pretty easy to use. Yes, it's another login, it's another whatever. Right. It'll be integrated with Office Suite, right? The other thing I wanted to mention is CF is still working on our governance documents, and it does define, well, we define some committees and some things in there, but we're looking at even more things. A few things I just wanted to mention in the open source world, there's a lot of governance documents out there. Matplotlib has a really nice, like 1-page, 1.5 page thing that lays out who the users, developers, committers, and then a committee that kind of governs, and it has some really nice text in there. So that's really useful. And also the Python library process has some really nice governance documents. They also went through, not too long ago, a whole overview survey of all the things out there and voted on, they proposed like 5 different governance styles, and that's all documented in their, now I'm gonna, PEP, is it PEP? Yeah, PEPs, some of the 8,000 PEPs. Yeah. I mean, 8,000 series, 8,000, 8,001, 8,002.
Oh. Is it PEP or PIP? Is it PEP? Okay, great. Anything else on this issue before we move on?
I was going to say that this sounds like what you really want, what we really want to do is establish some standards for making these decisions about say, for example, stale, dead issues, that sort of thing, and just have those up front as part of the documentation for how the governance is executed. Now, of course, we have to agree on how we're going to do the governance, but once you have some guidelines, you can say, yes, if we don't hear from somebody within 90 days, then we will stale this issue or whatever it is. And just some guidelines like that that are right up front, everybody understands, would help make things clearer and also avoid misunderstandings.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe the repo has a governance markdown file in there, so we probably just need to go through it and update it. And so that can be an activity for the next telecon here. Okay.
Moving on to the next.
Moving on to the next issue. So this issue was about just sort of how we monitor the schema.org releases. This issue came up before they went to the monthly releases. And so now what you're getting is, if you subscribe to the schema.org core GitHub repository, is that you get an email each month with all their proposed changes. And right now I've just been sort of scanning that and then putting things on the agenda, but I just wanted to bring up, are there other things or more structured things that you want to do about that and reviewing the monthly core schema.org changes? Any thoughts? Otherwise, we can move on to the fun stuff.
Going once, going twice, moving on.
Okay, cool, great. All right, so a couple folks on the telecons here had put together this ESIP winter meeting tag across issues in the repository. And these were issues that they thought we should talk about here. And so we can just sort of run down the list. If you, actually, I think the first one was issue number 4, which is our oldest one here on, is this the metadata one, Matt? Yes, okay. So there isn't a great way in the core schema.org vocabulary to describe all the files related to a data set. And so you've got the data set, which is like a conceptual thing, and then you've got the actual files related to that data set. Some of those being data, some of them being documentation, metadata. And so this thread was about how we describe the relationships between all these files that sort of comprise that data set. And I think Steve Richard and Dave Viglas had this really interesting conversation about this specific issue. And it seemed like they came down to the consensus that we can use this property called subject of for a data set to describe the ancillary files. Is that right, Steve? Yeah. Okay. Feel free to take a minute or two to read that issue if you want, but are there any thoughts about issues with using subject of to point to or make the relationship between the concept of a data set and its metadata, supplemental docs? I'm like, yeah, Ruth, go ahead.
So I think that's probably the best you can do if you accept that schema.org would never try and do something properly, which was allow you to say what the type of the thing is, you know, that it's the metadata for, that it's the, I don't know, what other kind of ancillary things go along. Well, described by or map of or related publication. You know, there's all these different kinds of connections of objects to other objects. And the question is, do we have to shove them all into that? Because then, I mean, it removes a lot of the utility, because you don't know really, unless you're parsing text, oh, this is metadata, which might be okay if you have a controlled vocabulary of the possible things you put there, maybe. But then you need to govern that too.
Yeah, so for it to really, I mean, there's a couple things in there that basically the encoding format, right, would, in the proposed, I think it's in that August 23rd message where the sort of example is. I think that might be the, so yeah, so basically the encoding format, you know, has the URI for the XML schema for the metadata. Ideally, any metadata convention would have some identifier for it. That is the case for some of them, but a lot of them don't. So you need some kind of string that would let you say it's this kind of metadata. But yeah, given what's there, you kind of have to use the description and a convention to say this is the metadata about. Right? There's also related to is another property that you could, but that is sort of just as convoluted. And the metadata, the data is the subject of the metadata, so at least it's semantically correct.
Okay, so so related to Steve, what you were bringing up, there's not a lot of fields to describe what the content actually is. So you've got this field where you can describe the MIME type, but not necessarily the encoding, I guess. And so here was one proposal. Can make it a little bit bigger. So okay, we've got a data set here. It's got distributions that are the actual data, and then there's the subject of for the metadata. And what we're trying to figure out is that, yes, it's XML, but it's a certain type of flavor of XML. It's following a specific profile. And so there was some discussion about how do we encode both of those attributes, or do we need a new property here? And so in this example, we put the MIME type in the encoding format field and then just use the additional type to specify the type of XML that it is. Is that something that everyone feels good about, or do we need an extension field? Does anyone agree that this is a problem, or is it not necessary? But I think for the harvesters that are wanting to harvest this specific metadata, they kind of need to know more than just it's XML.
Yeah, I think this is great, and I'm in support of this proposal. The one other thing we talked about earlier in the thread to add that we could consider adding to this is adding specifically the CITO documents field, which is intended as a field to indicate that a particular entity provides the documentation for another entity. And so it sort of creates that role association. So it's not just that this is an XML document in this particular encoding format. It's that it particularly provides the documentation for something else. And I think the question is that redundant with the subject of predicate or not? Is subject of and CITO documents, are those equivalent predicates, or like, yeah. CITO, so the citation ontology, it's the property is called documents, and then there's an inverse documented by.
I just want to mention in passing another ontology that has some relevant relations. SCIO, semantic science ontology, has refers to, it has subcategories of represents, these are all relations, represents, references in relation to, has data item, is data item in, and describes, which is subcategory as is about or specifies. So there are areas you can look at that are doing that, and we should try to align with them.
Hi, I think it is a problem as well, and maybe also not just for the metadata, that for data sets generally you need to describe a profile. So,
yeah.
So,
right. Well, let's just vote on that point. Does anyone disagree that the profile information is important? Anyone dissenting? Okay, so we all need to specify the profile. Okay, now we're just going to figure out how to do it.
So my comment on that is, if this is not a controlled vocabulary, I can tell you from having crawled the web for 6 months that there will be no two that are the same, even if they are. So if it's not a controlled vocabulary, you're hosed.
Definitely.
So yeah, I mean, that's why basically, I mean, it's something missing in a lot of metadata specs is saying, here's the URI to identify things that conform to this spec. There is a thing that Tom Krolitis has built on the web for sort of informally doing that. You can ask me about that. And that tried to implement some of that stuff. But the other thing I was going to say, Adam, going back to your suggestion there, the problem I see with what you've got there, whether it's in additional type or encoding format, is not, that's not the issue. But But if somebody was parsing this, they would probably have, and they were looking for ISO metadata, and they didn't necessarily need NOAA ISO metadata. They would probably look for the string, that ends in GMD. And because that string is GMD hyphen blah, right, they wouldn't hit. But it should match. So that's why I was thinking you actually need, it's a cascade. There's a sort of hierarchy of these things from XML, the highest level MIME type, to the high, it's the high level specification, and then the specific profile. And you probably need to put identifiers in for all three of those to really make it work.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah. I was going off of the Data One formats control vocabulary. This is just one of the URIs for that specific flavor. But I guess we have to think about this in the context of what are the use cases. And so I don't think Google's going to really care. But so maybe the other harvesters do care though. So what are the use cases and how can we best address
So one comment, I just went to bioschemas.org, right? And the way that they do this jump off, they do use the additional type and additional property. They link to things like the gene ontology. So from additional type, they go to GO. So if you have a data set that's about some gene disease association, that's the example here, that's then annotated back to the additional property value, right? And so there's two mechanisms. It's not just additional type, but there's also additional property, which let you then hook off to controlled vocabularies and other sorts of things. I don't know that there is some discussion, I think, on this topic in the bioschemas discussion lists. So they've also gone through the same thing, and they also have the same problem with tons of controlled vocabularies, right?
Yeah, nice.
So
can you post that in that issue number 4? It'd be good to see. I don't know how you use additional property in this context, so that'd be great to see.
So I just wanted to clarify on the additional type thing that there's going to be lots of vocabularies that any given processor may or may not recognize. I think it's a separate issue as to whether or not a given processor can recognize those or not. This GMD NOAA one is a great example because it's basically ISO metadata, but it's a NOAA specific variant that's incompatible with the original schemas. So it's not a subclass of It is not a subclass of the ISO TC 111. We had to create a separate type for it because the schemas are incompatible. And we discovered that through trial and error in harvesting through Data One. And so we have a controlled type vocabulary for all the metadata formats that we know how to handle, specifically because through trial and error, we've discovered, which ones are actually the same and which ones, some people declare their metadata as a vocabulary, but are actually different. And sometimes those are type compatible and sometimes they're not. So I think we're gonna just have to deal with the fact that there's a lot of different vocabularies and we're gonna see lots of strings in there. From my perspective, as long as we know that we're gonna put that in additional type, we're all set. Because then any processor can decide whether they know how to deal with that type or not, right? Like we're not trying to establish here what is the list of additional types we accept. It's just where do you put the type so that everybody knows where to go look for it.
Oh, okay. So Steve, you're saying make it an array and put in the types that it conforms to. Got it.
But there ought to be some sort of best practice related to this. Like if you know that it's a particular profile of ISO, here's the way you say that. This is exactly the string you would use for this profile. This is exactly the string you'd use for that profile. In other words, you have a nice controlled vocabulary. It needs not to be yours. It needs to be everybody's so that everybody can use it. And that needs to be part of this process.
Well, that's a good point, Ruth. I think one of the things that Doug and I tried in the P419 project was when we needed a resource on the web that we didn't want to create our own vocabularies, can we use the concept URIs at Wikidata or something like that to talk about things like what MD5 is, what SHA-256 is, what Swagger APIs are. Like we don't have to redefine all those things. So if we want to go down that road, is Wikidata and the URIs there a decent place to describe these things?
I always have an opinion. I would say probably not, but that all the kinds of things that need to be described, we need to pick what And hopefully they're harmonized ontologies or sources we are going to use. So we kind of need a list of, what the questions are so we can provide the answers. Because I don't know that Wikidata is always the best thing. I've looked at some of the stuff in there and it's not great.
Any other thoughts? No. Jump in.
I agree with Ruth there. Wikidata, DBpedia, whichever one. And I think the more we think about this, the more opportunity there is for us to just address it by pushing. If the record over it, Wikipedia, isn't substantial enough, then we push in whatever knowledge we have into that resource, and then we just use it. I mean, that's what it's there for, and that's what everybody else has been doing for all the stuff that's already in there.
Yeah.
But I agree with Ruth. I mean, there's differences between the quality of concepts across these, I suppose, databases.
Is there a place in core that we can throw concepts like this or make controlled vocabularies, or are they already in like Suite or other places?
I mean, definitely in core you could, but I think that not actually for earth science. See, this is the other thing that why I think Ruth and I we've not talked about this before the meeting really, but I think it's the observation is that for earth science, I think maybe Wikidata and DBpedia don't have augmented, I think, or substantial enough knowledge about a lot of these things. I don't know, it's interesting because you go to one thing and it's decent over at DBpedia and it's not in Wikidata, and you go to one thing at Wikidata, it's decent, it's not in DBpedia. So I think it varies across the board. That is my experience anyway.
Back to Ruth.
So I guess the issue to me is there are a lot of sources. We need to figure out which ones to use for what fields. And I note that core deals with controlled vocabularies extremely well, having populated it with about 15 of them in the last couple of months. So, that is like not a problem.
So in the context of this, about talking about metadata or a certain file encodings, what is the place that we should use?
Actually, I thought Matt told me at one point what the place was for that. But there is an ontology for that. I just don't remember what he said.
Matt, do you remember? Did you guys seed your data one list off of an ontology or a controlled vocabulary of file formats?
Yeah, we started with MIME types, and then we intersected that with there was a pronom database, and so we basically just pulled types from MIME types, and then added things that were domain specific. So like NetCDF, there are 4 different NetCDF versions. The MIME type for NetCDF, there's one MIME type, and then we divided that into 4 separate format types to deal with the different versions, so we could identify which NetCDF files were of which type. But we probably could, and I'm about to type the link to the service there. But yeah, we could definitely add a vocabulary like this to core, and that would be great.
Suite has concepts for some of these, I suppose, geospatial formats, but they've not been updated in a long time. And there must be some other resource that's bang up to date with this. I mean, is IANA not the MIME type registry?
I'm not sure. Does anyone know if?
I think it's IANA.
Yeah, IANA.
Yeah, it's the MIME type registry, the global or international MIME type registry, I think, is in there. They don't publish that as linked data, I don't believe, but there must be some resource out there for these types of things.
Okay, great. So sounds like the action is to create a controlled vocabulary list in core, maybe seed it with the data one formats. We can use the URIs out of there, and we're going to use the additional type field for now. Is that the guidance that we want to put in the documents? Any objections? Or do we want to use Cyto? or SIO? Yeah, go ahead, Alistair. Did you have a?
It's outside of schema.org, but there's work that might be of interest that the excuse me, the W3C Data Exchange Working Group is working on a profiles vocabulary so that you can actually define your profiles, uniquely identify them, and it's using the DC terms conforms to property to refer to those identifiable things. So that work, which is all currently in draft form, is probably relevant here.
And it's their profiles ontology?
Yeah.
A draft of the profiles vocabulary.
Nice.
So, so there are a lot of candidate vocabularies, some of which are in works and some of which are not. I think one of the things early on when we were discussing, we said one of the guiding principles we should follow, and I think we're still following this, is that if there's a term already in schema.org that more or less covers what you want, then you should prefer that over a term from some other vocabulary. And so that's why I think we've been moving towards subject of, because that is from the schema.org vocabulary already, compared to like conforms to, which is not. So what do you guys think about that? Should we stick with that guidance?
We were looking at conforms to in the selfie, no, in the interoperability experiment, but that was part, we were using subject of to reference these out band things, and then conforms to was part of that object. So yeah, I'm not proposing replacing that. It would be, is it an alternative to additional type? And I take your point about, you want to stay inside schema.org. So the next thing would be, is this something where you actually engage with them to pull it into it, because it is something that is explicitly defined by the W3C to handle exactly this use case.
Yeah. We'll go to Chuck next.
I guess the reason that I was favoring using encoding format over additional type is the way I've been using additional type, and my understanding of what that property is supposed to be about is it's typing the actual schema.org object, not the thing that the schema.org object is about. So that's why it seemed to me like it made more sense to just add all those formats in the encoding form, an array, with a MIME type, and then, however many other identifiers there are for profiles or other specs that the target resource conforms to or is encoded by.
Chuck?
Yeah, and related to that, I know that there's some work there's at least a GitHub issue in schema.org's GitHub repo for web API. And underneath that is MIME content types that you expect in terms of negotiation for the object. So that also is, I think, part of that's going into pending. I'm looking up the issue number right now, but that's probably also a relevant path to being able to describe the sort of expected type of a request, right? If you're retrieving a data object.
Chuck, will you add that too? Yeah. Thank you. And Alistair, did you get a chance to add what you?
Great, I think I got it, yep. And so you're saying subject of, and then DC conforms to the file encoding. Is that okay with you, Steve? Is that?
I mean, I like the idea of trying to minimize the number of other namespaces we're bringing in. I agree that DC conforms to is a good property to use for that. It's just a question of, it means we're bringing in something from Dublin Core namespace, which I don't think we've done in any of the recommendations to this point. And, so I think encoding format works as well. So in the name of not importing anything, that's the only reason I'd say, let's not use DC, but.
Yeah, my only hesitancy with overloading the encoding format is I believe they're looking for MIME types in that field. So I hesitate to put URIs in there if it's not expected.
I'm looking at the documentation. So I will put a link, but I've got the GitHub. So I will add this to our GitHub repo, but this is web API type in schema.org, and the issue number is 1423. It's a long issue. There's 92 comments. So there's extended discussion about this. So I'm a little hesitant at this point until they're at the point of sort of finalizing this, that this seems to be somewhat in flux. But I was just looking at encoding format. So Dan Brinkley's comment, I'm trying to see if it's a URI or no, I think it's actually a RFC, actual MIME type. So that's supposed to be put into that, so. Yeah.
So it would work actually.
Yeah.
Yep.
But I guess the comment is that I don't know that I'd make a final decision on you might make a pending decision, but I don't think I'd make a final decision until they make a final decision. Otherwise, you could end up with something incompatible in some ways, right?
Chuck, can you link that issue in there?
I'm going to do that, yeah.
But we need decisions to move forward just so that we can start getting people out. We might have to make changes and update the guidelines, but some of these issues take years to work out through the W3C process. So
yeah. So maybe, I think maybe that lends more towards using the Dublin core term so we don't misuse a schema.org term. Let them figure it out. What do you guys think?
Who likes Dublin core?
Some of this I think is also a process sort of workflow discussion. And so schema.org has this idea of pending and then final, right? And so I think that maybe something like that would be of use here, where you could certainly put all this stuff into pending. People that adopted it would then have some breadcrumb that this may change, right? And probably will change, but it's still at least usable.
So any objections that DC terms conforms to? Once,
Opening up the
twice.
DC can of worms.
can I suggest that we write up an architectural decision record that summarizes this and then have everybody comment on it online to see if everybody agrees?
Yep.
A pull request with the architecture and decision. Is that what Stefan wants?
So do we put the architecture decision record in a pull request, or how would we just more nuts and bolts, right?
I can draft one up and then link it to the issue, and then folks can see how the ADRs are built.
Okay, kids, this is a really good example of where you want to get input from people outside the hardcore tech community. Whether they're invested in Dublin core or they're willing to stick with what schema.org is currently. And so an architecture decision record, what is that? How is that determined? How do you engage that? And I don't want an answer to that, but I just highlight that this is the sort of an example of what Ruth was talking about earlier, where you really want that data management perspective on this sort of issue.
Yes, definitely. Yep. So Mark, the architecture decision records have a status field, and so this record will just quickly document what we've talked about, and the status will be proposed, and let the community vote on it. We'll bring it up at the cluster meetings, and we can put it in the ESIP mailing list and then vote on it. Yeah. If anyone has objections.
Okay, so beyond ESIP, I propose that whatever is written here for the data management community to vet, say here's a suggestion, but it needs to go out to all the various mailing lists that are relevant. For example, I would send it to the polar data mailing list. It probably needs to go to the relevant RDA groups. It probably needs to go to whatever Kirsten thinks her group needs, because she actually is thinking of assigning somebody to this. So, there's communities outside of ESIP also that need to at least, be given the option of commenting.
And there be dragons, because this is where we could then end up, having a 3-year discussion and never resolving what's relevant.
Well, so that was why I was going to make the suggestion that document, whatever it looks like, has things like a drop dead date, in it. We need comments by X if they're going to be, have any impact on anything.
So this strikes me as just a really nice example that maybe we can use to sort of sort out that earlier issue. How would we address this? This is something that we clearly need to get a diverse opinion from different archive managers and technical implementers. So just as a thought exercise, what would be the best way to do that to get, a resolution within a reasonable amount of time? And I'm not saying we solve that now, but this for me really crystallizes the issue is how we might try and assign those sort of roles and processes to get that done.
Yeah. Ruth, I don't know how you feel, but I don't know if or me or Kai are the right people to email all these lists. Like, I feel like if they are interested in this topic, they need to join this group. So I don't know if it's our responsibility to blast out to
Okay, so I'm happy, and it sounds like Mark's happy to be the representatives that email the various and sundry polar communities. Obviously I'm not going to cover all the other kinds of communities out there.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a role. Maybe it's a liaison role. I don't know what to call that role.
Yeah. Yeah, I think certainly there's.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're right. I think it was Adam. You're right. We can't, bend over backwards to try and include everybody, but we also can't be just like, well, if you didn't join the group and you didn't comment, then, well, your opinion doesn't matter. Well, this sort of thing, we need to make a concentrated effort to be inclusive. And it's not even inclusive. It's, we have to actually reach out and grab on certain things. And this, to me, just strikes me as one that's one of those things, because people have their well-established metadata practices that they're not going to want to break.
Okay, great. So I think we can wrap up this one. Let's move on to the next issue, which is 67. And this was on, recommendations on specifying a date modified for the data set. Is that right? Yeah. Matt or Dave, either of you want to chime in on this? This seemed like you guys mostly highlighted this issue.
Matt or Dave?
Oh, does he have a mic? I don't know if...
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yeah, Dave, thanks.
All right. I'm just refreshing myself on what we're talking about here. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're on number 67, right?
Oops. Did you have that, Dave?
Yeah, I've got it now.
So the issue is basically that whenever we're looking at the references to elements that are within a schema.org, it's nice for a harvester to know whether or not that element has been modified since the last time they did a harvest, which prevents you having to re-harvest an entire site in order to update. And so having a good date modified field within the schema.org record really improves the efficiency of an overall harvested search system. And so the issue is basically asking what should that field be and what should we recommend people provide?
Yeah, it's also a little bit expanded from that too, in that it goes to the recommendation about the feed as well on how to provide modified dates just to make it more efficient to harvest. So, the last mod in the sitemap, and then within the schema.org markup. And then the next level of granularity, if someone wants to harvest the components of a data set, then it's very helpful to know when those components may have changed as well. So it's like a hierarchy of modification times.
So the challenge is making, right now there's a date modified property, but typically that's scoped to the data set, not to the metadata about the data set, or to the metadata record itself, right? So the challenge is how do you scope the date modified to that actual schema.org object, right? Not so, I mean, even in the example up there shows how you would scope it to the original XML full metadata record, but how do you scope it to the schema.org object?
think you have to do that through the graph object. So because it's JSON-LD, the graph object itself has metadata about that graph object, about that graph fragment. And so that would essentially be I think the mechanism by which you would have to do that, is that the graph fragment change. Yeah, so the graph fragment has a modified time, and then the stuff inside of it has a modified time, right?
Sorry, I'll give it to Doug first. Oh, because I thought you raised your hand first.
I beat you to it. So, and I've been quiet. So Chuck, the only thing I would say on that is that of all the groups that have been providing graphs for us, none of them have used graph. Okay, and right, and I have a hard time thinking that at this point we can go to them and say, oh, by the way, you need to provide us quads, right? The other thing, Matt, I don't quite follow is that if the goal, the functional goal, is to reduce harvesting, and then how does a date modified inside the data graph help that, because you've already harvested it to parse that element of it? Why aren't we just using the sitemap last mod node in that regard? Because it seems to me like I've already harvested the data graph. I care less if it changed now. Processing it down my workflow is kind of like irrelevant at this point. The hard part was doing the query to get it. So, I mean, I'm just kind of curious.
Well, I mean, if you view the metadata record as a data set that might be in a package or something like that, it's useful to have a date stamp on the metadata record itself.
Sure, if that's pointing to a resource that you want, I thought the functional goal was whether we do the harvest of the resource itself with that data graph.
So there's a hierarchy here. The sitemap is a set of pointers to the dataset landing pages that would contain a schema.org record. So that sitemap has a last modified field that you can determine when you need to go reharvest schema.org. But that schema.org then will have pointers to components of that dataset, one of which might be another metadata record like this, say, ISO record. We want to know whether or not that ISO record has changed in order to go figure out whether we have to go re-retrieve that and get a new version of that, or other types of things that might be described in that schema.org record that we want to harvest as part of the metadata collection for that data set. And so it's those hierarchies that are where we gain some efficiencies of not having to reharvest the entire thing every time.
Any other comments or thoughts there? Is that something that we can put into the guidance documents? I don't know if we have one for building sitemaps, but that would be nice. Okay, silence is golden. Okay, moving on. So it sounds like we can do that. We can put that in the docs. Okay, the next issue was, let's see, what copyright or software licenses should be used? Ruth, this was your issue here. Did you want to comment on that a little bit?
Right. So the issue really is that anything we do here needs to have some sort of license or waiver of licenses associated with it, so people know if they can reuse it or not, and if they reuse it, what they have to do. Now, in general, I vote for CC0 because it ought to be a norm for people to cite everything. But I've recently become really aware that CC0 can lead to issues that'll be coming up at the next RDA meeting, where like Figshare copied all of everybody's metadata and data and just, kind of like stole it and is re-advertising it from their own sites. So, the question is who and how should all of this stuff, be made available?
So maybe it's because I'm late in the day. I'm going to ask a clarifying question. What stuff, right? So there's different products, right? So certainly the data producer, it's up to them to choose an appropriate license and hopefully have a license field. I mean, there's already schema.org markup that describes that. And I think there's an example there with license in the data set. So that's one thing. I think that the products of this group probably should agree on a license in the GitHub repo that allows reuse of whatever snippets and products that come out, whether those be actual software products, in which case a software license would be appropriate, or if they're more conceptual products, then this. And there was a long discussion about this in, I don't remember which group that we were part of, but that Ruth is, I think. Actually, it was Suite. There's the Suite licensing. There was, yeah. And then I guess that the third thing is that there will probably be gaps that are specific to earth sciences, which is this whole idea of maybe geoschemas or something like that. In which case there's things like subclass of place or something like that. In which case I think that the community that's developing that should then come up with an appropriate license, but be explicit about it, right? So is that? I'm not sure. I'll pin. Okay.
Yeah. But Ruth, you're right. There isn't any text that talks about this issue or recommends that for license we should use URIs or what. It's really ambiguous when you look at the document. There's just a code snippet that uses a URI, but the field actually takes text or URL, and we make no stand on whether we should use. So maybe we need to. Right.
So that's a consequence of schema.org, right? So schema.org basically says that it can be a text or URL field. I think that so this may be a place where the guidance is that preferably it's a URL so that you can, a URI identifier, which is what the example that you have there, I think uses. You scroll down. So it's the Creative Commons license URI. So because that also contains version information, all kinds of stuff, you can dereference it, find out more information. I'm pretty sure that the GNU, somewhere I have snippets for different license types that are represented by sort of dereferenceable URIs. So.
And I'd like to point out, Adam, that there's another issue that we did for the Polar Data Forum on number 47 that suggests that we add to the guidance that these license URLs be pulled from the SPDX controlled vocabulary of licenses, because right now nobody really knows what license URIs to use for licenses. So.
Nice. Can someone link those issues if they're not already linked? That's a great one. So link 47 to 60. And these all have URIs, Matt, you're saying? Can we just make the recommendation that they use? So, I mean, I don't know if a repository, I don't know, is that a huge ask if they don't have, if they have, like, let's say this identifier here, to have them go back and change them all with URIs?
The URIs are the links on the left.
Oh, yeah. Right. Okay.
To Ruth.
And if somebody would be happy to turn that into a controlled vocabulary in core. Because quite frankly, if it's not easy to use, it's not going to get used. So they should do that. They should turn it into a nice little ontology and stick it in core. Give me their names.
The hit list. Okay, so maybe the decision here is to update the documentation to point to this resource as one of the text or URL values. How to grab the URL.
What from that table to use, whether to use the thing they call the identifier or to pull the URL that's behind the link on the left column, right?
Yes. Yep. So I guess that begs the question for the Creative Commons that do have URIs already, are those okay too? Like CC BY 4.0.
Do you think they're suggesting the codes because the URIs change? So that's why they want the codes.
So there isn't a small ontology for the Creative Commons because their URLs don't change and they do have the version number in them. And it's in core, and the Creative Commons folks have said that they will be posting that link to their website at some point. But that hasn't really been true for all of the rest of it.
I'm sorry, Ruth. So this SPDX link should go to their website?
No, I mean, the Creative Commons URLs are stable and versioned. And there is an existing ontology that if you use the word CC0, you get the right URI at the Creative Commons. And they said that they would put a link to that ontology on their website.
Over to Chuck.
So given that this is probably a spectrum of solutions, I think that it's probably not one or another. I think that, you know, if you're using something that's a Creative Commons or something that is, I think, GNU, there's some other licenses that also have a similar sort of structure, then I think that that perfectly makes sense. It looks like, you know, this SPDX, though, because it's more encompassing, is an alternative in sense that, okay, you're using some obscure license that because that's what the academic that originally did this attached to it. How do I describe that? Well, don't leave the license blank, but this is an alternative to that, right? So something is better than nothing, right, in some ways.
Okay, we got 9 minutes left. Are you guys up for one more issue, or do you want to talk about other things? There's 2 more.
We've got a hand in the back.
Philemon, you got something?
I was waiting for that section that says we're doing something to get schema.org be recognized by Google. Will you guys be discussing along that line? Because it's not really fully absorbed by Google yet. Are you have any efforts to leading to that?
Can you give us an example there? Is this what you were mentioning over lunch?
Yes, I do, because apparently the point map that I have there always points to Antarctica, although the map points to the Gulf of Mexico. The general coverage always reads Antarctica, but that's only for point map. So I don't know where the problem is. I don't know if the problem is within schema.org, or is it Google not really ingesting everything that is current in schema. There are other issues also associated to, say, the definition of the author itself. Somehow, Google, the data search engine of Google, always gets to define their authorship based on the acronym you used for your project. I said, okay, let me rephrase that. I'm trying to find a word for that. Every project has many data contributors, and they should pick the authorship for a particular data based on those tags. Somehow they don't read those tags. Somehow they go directly and just read what project created those particular, or that particular data. So hence my question. Perhaps this group can organize, or ESIF can organize a little activity to get Google and schema.org, see face-to-face and resolve some of these issues. I already submitted this to Google, but I had no response from them.
First off, is anyone else publishing geocoordinate, just a point data? Are you guys seeing the same thing at Google Dataset Search, where it's showing a map of Antarctica? Okay, maybe we can get you guys hooked up and take a quick peek to see if you have the same issue. If so, then let's create a GitHub issue for that. That's great.
I have one question. This is Daniel Fuga. and maybe Ruth can help me explain it. Where would something like data privacy and restrictions lie? I don't think that it is necessarily in the license, because that might actually describe some other component of the data sets. But in the example I'll use is farmers share their data with us, but they that data can harm them in the future in lawsuits. So they rather just specific researchers be able to access it and not the government or something like that. How is there a place that suggests the level of privacy that we have already existing, or is there an easy way to do this?
Does anyone have restricted data or yeah, privacy issues with anything they've published in schema.org? That's a good point, Dan. I don't know if we've covered this in the guidance docs.
I'll bring it to the next meeting. It might be too large of a topic.
Great, and please feel free to submit an issue on the scienceonschema.org about that.
Yeah, we should definitely submit an issue, but this was discussed at the Polar Data Forum as well. And if I recall, that is you try and use a license that indicates that there are restrictions, and then you specify the restrictions elsewhere. And that may not even be in schema.org. It may just be that you found the data set. To access it, you then have to learn more about what you need to do to access it.
There is a field on the data set that I think it's called is accessible for free, and it's just a Boolean. That probably doesn't do a good enough job of describing the.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
I thought that's where, and granted, licensing of data sets is still a nascent field, but I thought that's sort of the idea of the license, is to indicate fair use.
Okay, great. So we've got 4 minutes left.
Sorry.
I think these next issues are a doozy. Unless anyone wants to chime in on restricted data sets, I think we should probably think about wrapping up and calling it. Any last thoughts before we?
What's happening with the incubator proposal?
Right. I'm not sure, honestly.
Yeah.
Did you hear anything from Annie Burgess, or is there anything moving on a test bed proposal?
Yeah, she gave me a little bit of advice as to how to phrase these things. I mean, salary is not allowed, but you can say things like pay for documentation, pay for blah, blah, blah tutorial, etc. 1,000 here, 2,000 there, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So yes, I do think we need to do that. And yes, I was planning on doing it.
Okay. Is there time at the ESIP meeting here that we can help write that document with you?
That would be lovely. I don't know when it is.
Yeah, right.
I suppose we could get together, I don't know, during lunch or something. Can't be tomorrow, unfortunately.
Not tomorrow? Yeah, it closes on the 10th, so we've got 3 more days here.
Right.
But I think if we made a good effort here while we're at ESIP, then.
And I do note that it's only a 4-page proposal and that it really is a bunch of questions that you have to answer.
Yeah.
And some of them I think are pretty straightforward.
Yeah. First of all, who's interested in jumping on an ESIP testbed proposal? This is to get some funds to work on this scienceonschema.org. Okay, great. Can all you folks do lunch on Thursday? Thursday lunch? Okay, so we'll find Ruth Thursday at lunchtime and we'll help write this testbed proposal. Is that okay? That's fine. Okay.
Ruth has consented.
All right, thank you everyone for spending your time here today. It was great to get some of these big issues that have stuck around for a long time now discussed, and I'll publish out the ADRs. Come check us out at the next Telecon. I believe it's January 23rd, and we'd look to see you there. Thank you very much.